Well, it means that the quality of education is less on reserve. And Canadians should ask themselves, like, if we want young people on reserves to do better, why are we giving them a poorer quality of education, right? Like, these are the parts of the country and the young people who need the most investment, and yet we're making the least amount of investment in them, right? So what kind of message does that send to a young person, right? What kind of quality of education are they getting? But in a more realistic, I guess, kind of practical way, the impact is that schools on reserve usually have a tough time attracting and retaining teachers because they can afford to pay the teachers less, and they're non-union teachers as well, right? So a young teacher might go to a First Nation to go work for the first year or two of their career, but eventually, once they get some experience, they're probably going to leave to a higher paying, more secure, potentially unionized environment somewhere else, right? And so what happens to schools on reserve if they don't have the best teachers? Well, it means that, the quality of instruction there is suffering. But there's also, impacts in every area that education dollars are spent, Everything that the core operating money goes towards suffers when there's less money. But we also know that there's also less money for renovations and for the school buildings themselves too. So in some communities, you have kids going to school in old, dilapidated buildings. Sometimes they're playing sports in gyms that are, well past their prime. And really, just everything tends to suffer in an environment where there's not adequate funding. My family left the reserve so that I could be educated in a good environment, right? Like, that lets you know how serious this issue is. Like, my family physically moved off the reserve so that I'd have an equal shot at life compared to other kids in this country, right? Should a kid have to move? Should a kid's family have to move because their parents want them to have an equal shot at life in this country? I thought the Canadian Charter, Rights and Freedom said otherwise. We should be able to live wherever we want in this country and have a good shot at life. But I think overall, like, young people have the right attitude. Young people know what it takes to be successful, but we have to support them more, right? Like, we have to live up to all this rhetoric that we share about, like, we want young Indigenous people to succeed. We want young people in this country to do great. We have to put our money where our mouth is. You can tell when a government cares about something, they put money in it, right? So what does it tell you if they're not putting money into young Indigenous people? So one of the things that I saw when I went to school, just for like a week here or a week there on reserve, is that the classes on reserve were like probably a year behind where I was going to a school in the city, right? So what do you think happens when a kid comes out of a school that's a grade level behind and then they go to university? Well, it probably means that either they're going to be unprepared and are going to struggle, or they're going to be really stressed out and they're going to be scrambling for the first year in university as they catch up and try to succeed. And really, we should be doing everything that we can to make sure students come to post-secondary, universities, colleges, ready to hit the ground running and do awesome on day one. So the inequity in funding on reserve, First Nations education funding, it means that we're not doing all that we can to make sure that young Indigenous people are successful at post-secondary. I feel like every Canadian should care about every young person in this country. You can't blame a child because of where they grew up. You can't blame a child for where they were born, right? You should believe, just on a humanistic level, on a level of caring about every single person in this country, that everyone in this country has an equal shot at life. It shouldn't be more complicated than that. But apparently it is, because we don't deliver equal opportunity to every child born in this country. So let's talk about the numbers. Well, a lot of people have looked at the numbers and have said that the country's GDP would rise by over $150 billion within a few years if we leveled access to education and to employment. So even if you look at it from an instrumental perspective, it's in everyone's better interest to support First Nations education, right? A rising tide lifts all boats. Young Indigenous people who go on to education are more likely to be successful, and they'll contribute more to our overall economy, but also to our public sphere, to the overall discourse in this country. So we'll all be better off. But I would hope, and I think that most Canadians do care about every baby born in this country, about every child born in this country. And the only reason that a gap in education persists is just because these issues are out of sight and out of mind for many Canadians. So this election, let's say that now is the time that we are going to finally fix this thing. We're going to stop ignoring it. We're going to live up to what we know is right. You know, if you put it before the average person, like, I'm sure every person in this country is going to say, yeah, every kid deserves the same shot. Every baby deserves the same chance at life, right? So let's live up to that this election. Let's make sure that we demand that every party that wants our vote is going to actually act to eliminate the gap for funding for First Nations education. Well, I think a more prosperous Canada, you know, more prosperous Indigenous communities, less reliance on social services, and just a better quality of life. You know, I think our whole country would be better off if First Nations children received the same education funding as everyone else. But I really get excited about what would happen for our communities, because it's not just about getting a job, and it's not just about getting an education, right? Like, if you go to school and you realize that you're getting the same quality of education as everyone else, like, you're gonna grow up with a more positive outlook on life, right? Like, we neglect parts of our country, and then we ask why people there are rebelling or are not excelling, right? Why don't we send them the message that we love them, we care for them, and we want them to succeed, and then see how they do? You know, I'm sure people will start doing a lot better. So it's really about unlocking the potential for everyone in this country, especially on reserve, to be able to live a meaningful, productive life. Well, I think the first thing you should do is you should talk to every politician who tries to talk to you this federal election about the gap in First Nations education funding. Politicians don't lead, they follow, right? Politicians follow what they hear on the doorstep, they follow what they see in polls, and they follow what they hear in focus groups. So if you tell politicians that this is something that you care about, it's something that they're going to start talking about and something that they're going to start acting on. Some of the parties have already addressed this issue and have said they will do certain things about it. But even the parties that haven't, you know, you could still have an impact by telling your local candidate that this is something that matters to you. Because then that candidate, if elected, will bring that forward in caucus or in cabinet or what have you, right? So even if it isn't in a party platform, you still talk to the candidates about it, still make this an election issue. And then most of all, on October 19th, go out and vote.